is mediating with religious parties. As several of you all have experienced, Melissa just gave a shout out to that. She's a pastor and a professional preacher, so she may have a lot of things to share about this. Oh, damn, I can't curse.
Oh, no, you can't. I hear you, and you're totally fine.
Melissa said that cursing is forbidden, so that's okay.
And encouraged.
And even encouraged, okay. So, as several of you all have experienced as mediators over the last year, we had about 6 different cases that involved religious organizations in one role or the other. Sometimes the religious organization was the plaintiff, sometimes it was the defendant. Some of the things we experienced were just some basic contract things that you would see in small claims court, issues around auto repairs. There was one I remember with a church bus that was involved. One was a neighbor complaint issue. Another was involving legal fees. Some of the things that we ran into that oftentimes a lot of people showed up. It wasn't usually just one person representing the religious organization. There were a lot of people. Sometimes there were issues around who had the authority to enter into whatever it was, the car repair or the legal issues or whatever. And then sometimes another thing that perked up, sometimes to the good and sometimes that made the mediation more difficult, was just the perception that people had about how a church personnel should behave. So they were all very interesting. Our presenter today is Bachle-Fifer, and I'm very grateful to Joe Botsky for referring Ann to her, because I've had a couple conversations with her and she's just been delightful. Ann is very uniquely experienced in this area of mediating with religious organizations. She's a mediator, a facilitator, an arbitrator, and a mediation trainer. She's based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She's also a licensed attorney. Her mediation experience includes business, workplace disputes, as well as church-based conflicts, integrating Christian principles with the mediation. So welcome, Ann. We are so grateful to you for your willingness to join us today and share your insights and lead us in this discussion. So with that, Ann, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Gail, and I likewise have appreciated the opportunity to work with you. So let's begin with prayer. I'm kidding. We're not going to do that. But you may do that personally to whomever you typically pray to. That is part of my mediation practice, is to pray before I start every mediation. But that's sort of beside the point. This isn't about, it's so interesting to hear all of these cases that your center has been getting that involve these religious organizations. Very interesting. So we're going to talk about that, but I thought we would start first with a little poll. So Gail, if you can bring up that poll. Oh, Belinda's coming too. Cool.
Okay. How am I doing?
Yep, it's up there.
Okay.
So what can mediators do when both parties are known to be parties of the same faith tradition?
Are we supposed to answer?
So you pick
Yes.
one. Click on one, I
There's
believe.
four, yeah, I think you have to just click on
Is it
it.
on this sheet?
It
No.
should be on
And do you mean the same as the mediator?
No, the same as between them. The
As
parties
each other.
are of the same faith tradition.
Room. Think about it. And I'm instructing the folks here in the room to just read through the 4 options, and then we can add your vote to them,
Yeah.
to the poll when it's done.
Can you read the question?
The question is, what can mediators do when both parties are known to be parties of the same faith tradition? The first response is ignore it. The mediator must remain neutral. The second, if the mediator is of the same faith, the mediator may say something. Otherwise, the mediator should ignore it. Number three, the mediator may use the party's shared faith as a tool in the mediation. And number four, the mediator should berate the parties for ignoring the teachings of their faith. And so far, I'm very pleased that no one is selected.
Nobody's chosen that one. Okay, I'm about to end the poll. I see not everybody has voted, but
Do you want us in?
We can't vote.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
right. Yeah.
yeah, that's right, because it's online. So this hybrid thing, we're still getting used to this, right? So, okay, well, I'm going to end the poll, and I am delighted with the results that you had, because I think A is the safer answer, but I think C is the better answer. And so you covered both of those quite nicely. And so
Could
we're
you
going
share the
to-
results again, please?
Oh,
Let's see, are
Yeah, you can see it.
can you see it?
yep. So 40% said A, ignore it, the mediator must remain neutral. And 60% said C, the mediator may use the party's shared faith as another tool in the mediation.
But there is-
And as Gail noted, nobody
Yeah.
said the parties should berate the parties for ignoring the teaching of their faith.
And Anne, we have a question here in the room. So Lavana, do you want to raise your question?
So people may share the same faith, but I'm Jewish by birth. It doesn't mean that I practice Judaism like somebody else. So, that's why, like, I said 3, but this is given that they're both equal in terms of knowledge. But when one has more knowledge than the other, the first answer is really the best.
Yes, absolutely. It is definitely the safest. So yeah, we
Yeah.
tread cautiously when we go into C, right? But that is what I would like to talk with you about this afternoon. Ways that you can integrate the party's faith into the mediation, regardless of what your faith is. And so first of all, I want to acknowledge that, well, let me get my, sort of give you an idea here of what we're doing. So this is how I'd like to proceed. First, I want to talk about world religions, because basically all the world religions prohibit members of their faith from taking their disputes to court. And so that's kind of the starting point when we talk about faith-based mediation. So we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to, what I'd like to do is a little demonstration of what it might look like to mediate the beginning of a case where one party is a religious entity and the other party is of that same faith. And then I thought it might be fun for you to role play that and practice some of these things that we are talking about. And then we can have a broader discussion about how this integrates into the kind of work that you're doing in Ann Arbor. And if there's time and interest, I could also tell you a little bit about the Christian mediation process, because I am a Christian and I do a mediation process that is distinctively Christian, but I also do all other kinds of mediation depending on what suits the parties at the beginning. Yep. So all the world religions encourage their members to resolve their disputes within the community of faith. And so, for example, in the Jewish tradition, Jews were often excluded from access to the civil courts in the different countries where they found themselves living. And so they had to develop their own dispute resolution process. And one of those is known as the Bet Din. And Jews are encouraged, depending on what flavor of Judaism, strongly encouraged to the point of being prohibited. This quote from Maimonides: "Whoever submits a suit for adjudication to non-Jewish judges is a wicked man." So that's the Jewish tradition. The Muslim tradition is not quite as strict. So it's okay to sue only after exhausting all other means, including mediation. So legal action is permitted as a last resort. And the Quran instructs Muslims to seek reconciliation and compromise wherever possible. And then here's this quote from the Quran: "They should make a settlement between the two of them." So then Christianity, in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, which is part of the Christian scriptures, he says, "When one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of fellow believers? If you have such cases, why do you lay them before those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there's no one among you wise enough to settle a dispute between the brothers, and yet brother goes to law against brothers, and that before unbelievers? To have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded?" And so Christian scriptures are pretty adamant that believers are not supposed to be taking their disputes to the civil courts. So most churches and denominations and many other religions have developed internal dispute resolution processes for their members. But people are often not familiar with them, or they don't trust them. And so that is something that may be available anytime you have religious parties, that they could go to their own faith traditions dispute resolution process. But in my experience dealing with Christians, they come up with a million explanations for why they should be in court instead of in the Christian tradition. So, for example, a lot of Christian denominations have dispute resolution processes, but people will say things like, "Well, I thought that person was," I'll use Christian. "I thought that person was a Christian. He claims to be a Christian. He goes to church, but look at the way he's treating me. He's lied. He's stolen. He can't really be a Christian. And therefore, it's okay for me to take this to court. I don't have to pay attention to that teaching." Or people will say, "That requirement of resolving our dispute within the body of believers was for a different time and place. But here in the United States, we have judges who are fill in the blank, Muslim, Jewish, Christian. And so it's no longer such a big deal for us to bring our disputes to court. It's fine. That's an outdated requirement." Or they will say, "Our faith tradition's internal process is only for relational disputes or only for religious disputes. And this is a legal dispute. This is a contract dispute. So it doesn't have any place in the religious tradition." Or they may say, "Our tradition's internal process is biased, and it's run by leaders who are friends of our congregation's leaders, and we as lay people are not going to get a fair shake in it, and so that's why we can't use it." So those are some of the many excuses that people might give you for why they don't want to follow their own tradition's dispute resolution process. So if you find out, let me check here. Okay. If you find out that the participant, that both participants are in the same, from the same faith tradition, just let me get here. Yeah. There are, I'm going to suggest to you that there are some questions that you could ask people. And these are on your handout, and I'll share them on the screen also. So if you find out that both parties are of the same faith, regardless of what your faith is, these are some things that you could ask them. Does your religious tradition say anything about how you are supposed to resolve disputes with one another? And you could ask them this before the mediation. You could even ask it after the parties' openings when they have both indicated that they are of the same tradition. So you're just asking them about whether there's any process available to them other than the Dispute Resolution Center. You could ask them, how does your faith inform how you deal with this dispute? And you might get some interesting answers from that. You could ask them, would you like to resolve this case consistent with your spiritual beliefs? And if they say yes, then you could ask them what might that look like, and help figure out a way for you to mediate that would be consistent with that, as well as consistent with your own values. And you could certainly always ask them, would you be better served by finding someone who shares your beliefs to help you resolve this? So these questions are on your handout as well. So I think especially if one party is a religious entity, it would be entirely appropriate to ask them these questions. And they may have their own reasons for why they are not pursuing their own tradition's dispute resolution process. But you may, with the questions, you may actually plant a seed, and you may get them thinking about, yeah, maybe I should be using a different process. Maybe I shouldn't be in. Last day had a case involving a church, and he was telling me all about it. It was quite a case. Is his co-mediator on the at the meeting here today? Because I know he did it with.
Yes,
Now,
I did it with Joe.
Oh, did you, Al? Okay. Yeah, he was telling me about the and then both sides had attorneys, and yeah, quite an interesting
Well,
case.
And that the handicap with that was it was not coming to us with people volunteering for mediation. It was coming to us as a court order, and so we had to deal with that to break that down before we could even talk about it.
Okay, yeah, there you go. And Joe said, you guys asked the parties, why are you in court? You know, like maybe you shouldn't be. And he said that they didn't really have a good reason, but they definitely wanted to stay in the mediation process. They did not want to go to their, whatever their internal dispute resolution process might have been. So, you know, if all you can do is ask the question. If they say no, then you just continue mediating, right? And that's what you guys did, right, Al?
Yes.
Yeah. So what I thought I would do is a little demonstration of how this might work in a mediation. And then I'm going to give you a chance to practice that. So I would like 2 volunteers to play Sean and to play Pat, and I am going to give you your line. You only have one line, and I'm going to feed it to you and let you say it back. So this is pretty low key. Do I have a volunteer to play Sean? Zena, I saw that hand. Thank you, Zena. And do I have a volunteer to play Pat? I'm looking for another hand.
Claudia is raising her hand. She just doesn't know it.
Oh. Did you just get voluntold, Claudia?
Yes, I did. That's fine. Thanks, Zena.
Thank you, Claudia, for volunteering. Appreciate that.
Oh.
All right, so the role play facts are on your handout, and you're going to want to have that handy. Does everybody have that one-page handout that says mediating among religious parties.
Could you put it in the chat? Could you put it in the chat?
I will.
Thank you.
Can you do that, Gail?
Yep, I got it.
Sure.
Okay. You don't need it as a paper copy, but you're going to want to have it handy, both for the little demo that I'm going to do now and also for the role play that we're going to do in a minute.
Do you want the questions again or just the role play?
They will probably appreciate having the questions too.
Oh, okay.
Because we want them to practice using the questions in the role play. So if you can do that whole thing, Gail, that would be great.
Yeah.
The challenge is then if you don't have them already, you're going to want to copy them out of chat and save them someplace, because when we send you to the breakouts, you're not going to have them. You're going to lose them when we leave.
You can just put the document into chat and then we can open it.
Oh,
Can you do that, Gail?
let's see. Can I do that? Hold on. You all have to watch me do all this.
Yeah, so it's just a drag and drop of the document.
A drag and drop.
I wonder if I can I do that as a co-host?
Yeah, yeah, you can do that.
I have the document up, but then I don't know how to.
I don't know how to drag and drop it.
I don't either. How do we do that?
You would have to do that from the
Gail, if you go to the email.
from the folder that it's in. Yeah,
The
take the
PDF
folder
is
and
there.
Yeah, I can
sorry,
find
I'm
it.
so sorry.
Um,
Either that or you can tell me how to find it in email. I just didn't.
I sent an email out to everybody. So here it is now, but how do I get it?
Open it.
You don't want to open it. You just want to
I just wanna,
drag and drop
Oh,
the little
there.
icon. The little icon.
okay.
So sorry.
Hold on.
So
Can it be a screen share? Or do you
The
not want
screen
the rest
share-
of us to see?
the screen share doesn't work in breakouts. There is a way to do that, but I can't figure out how to do it.
Okay.
Well, hold on, I'm getting close. I'm getting
Oh
close.
yeah, okay, because from my thing,
Really?
it looks like it needs to be in Dropbox or Google Drive or something, and I don't have it in any of those
Hold on.
places.
This is
No,
really-
just from whatever folder it's in.
I did
Yeah,
it.
whatever folders. Oh, there it is. Yep. Thank you.
Now see if it works out.
Gail,
Yeah,
you're
and then
my
it says-
hero.
Oh,
Says click
Awesome.
to open. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, but then you will
Sorry, I
want
didn't-
to copy that into a Word document or someplace where you can.
It is a Word document. You just open it up. It is
Yeah,
a Word
but-
document.
Okay, but when you go into the breakouts, do you want to still be able to access it?
So you just open up the Word document and then you got it. Oh, I see what you're saying.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, just so
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can, yeah. All right, good. Okay, so as you know from your handout, which you all have access to in one way or another at this point, the role play facts are pretty basic. Sean owns a printing company. First Church ordered 500 Christmas booklets from Sean but has not paid for them. The parties have not communicated. Sean sued First Church in small claims, and it's been referred to mediation. And First Church is represented by its office manager, Pat. And so imagine that the mediator makes their opening statement, and then in her opening statement, Sean says, I'm a churchgoer myself, and I expected better from a church. And so now, Sean, could you repeat that statement to that effect?
I'm a churchgoer myself, and I expected more from the church.
So now the question is, what are you going to do with that as a mediator? You might be tempted to just ignore that. It doesn't have anything to do with the contract dispute, right? That's what it's kind of legally irrelevant. Who cares how a church behaves, right? But if you are a careful, cautious, experienced mediator, which I think most of you are, you know that this is important information. It might even be a key to unlocking the resolution, right? Because Sean obviously has these expectations, And so my suggestion is not to ignore what the party has told you about them behaving like a church, but to include it in your reframe of Sean's opening. Do I dare put somebody on the spot and see if they could come up with a way to reframe that comment? I'm a churchgoer myself, and I expected better from a church. Or do you want me to do it?
You advertise this as a demo. I think you have to do it.
Yeah, I did. I did. I was just offering in case anybody wanted to. Yeah. So you might say something like, so you have an expectation about how a church ought to manage business, and you were disappointed. And so now you're acknowledging that they have said that. You didn't wash over it. You didn't ignore it, but you're not taking a position on it. You know, you're still neutral, but you're reflecting back what they said about how the church behaves. So you know how to do that, right? It's just yeah. I think we get a little anxious when it's anything religious, right? And so I'm trying to quell that. I'm trying to encourage you that you have the mediator skills to deal with these topics. So I encourage you not to run away from them, but to just fold them into the way you conduct a mediation. Okay, so and then I would say, see if the church mentions anything about this in their opening. And if they don't, then I would save the follow-up for caucus. And then I would talk about this in caucus with Sean. Whenever we get to caucus, it would be one of the things I'd mention is your expectations of how a church ought to behave. But let's assume in our example that Pat, who is the representative from the church, mentions as part of her opening, we are a church, but we have to be prudent with how we spend our donors' money. So, Pat, would you like to share that statement for us?
Well, we are a church and we have to be very prudent as to how we spend our money.
Yeah, okay. So how might you reframe Pat's comment? Do we have any volunteers this time? So again, we're not going to ignore that, right? She said something about, you know, here's how the church views how it does business. And so you might say something like, so it's important for the church to manage its money well, right? That's just reframing back how she sees it. So now that you know that both parties are of the same faith, so the plaintiff has indicated that he's a churchgoer as well, now you could ask some of those questions that we were looking at earlier and that are on your handout. Things like, how does your faith inform how you deal with this dispute? Does your tradition say anything about how you're supposed to resolve disputes among yourselves? If you're not sure, would you like to research that? You've both indicated that you are of the Christian faith, and I'm wondering how that might affect the way you approach resolving this dispute. Those are all things you could say in the joint session to recognize the fact that they have this common tradition in there. So what I thought we could do is go into breakouts and just practice this. But before we do, yes, I want to see if you have any questions, and Zena does. Go, Zena.
So my experience with trying things like that is that if I ask about their traditions or what the church has said that they ought to do, I get two different answers.
Okay.
And since I don't generally have no idea what that particular faith tradition is, I then don't know what to do with that.
So you mean like one of them says, yeah, we're supposed to take this to the presbytery, and the other one says, no, the presbytery doesn't have anything to do with this. Something like
Correct.
that.
Yeah.
Okay. So
or we
so
go
then
to we go to the elders. No, we go to the minister.
Yeah. Right. I mean, ultimately you can't resolve that, right? And so, you know, it sounds like you've got a difference of opinion. Would you like to take some time to research that, or would you prefer to proceed with the mediation here? Right. So these are all just things that may get you into a different place, but you know, if it's not going to work, if the parties can't agree, then you just keep mediating, right?
And we have
Yeah.
a couple of comments here.
Okay.
In the room. Melissa, you want to go first, and then Alexandria, I think, has a comment too.
Hi, Anne. Thanks for giving a shout out to the Presbyterians.
I just did a case where that was the issue.
So my name is the Reverend Dr. Melissa Allison, and I serve as the stated clerk for the Presbytery of Detroit. So my question is contextual, because I'm crazily involved in all of the bylaws, policies, procedures, and also how nonprofit religious entities communicate with the legal world and the state. Is one of the first questions that mediators need to ask when talking, I would say, like the church secretary who's representing the church in this matter. Are they officially named as the person who is allowed to interface in the legal world in terms of being able to sign such documents, make such decisions on behalf of the church?
Interesting. So first of all, I'm delighted that you're in the class because you can give that perspective. And I think you did a case with Joe too, right?
Yes.
Yes, right. That involved another church. So
real deep into especially what happens with non-denominational or very independent churches that have no larger governing structure to help guide them in some of these areas.
Yes. Yes. Right. Yeah. Good. Okay. So your question is that, or suggestion is to make sure that the person is representing the entity in an official capacity. And so my question would be, is that concern unique to religious organizations, or is it broader than that?
That's a really great question. And as I say to the Presbytery quite frequently, I am not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV. I specifically deal with the polity and parliamentary aspects of the church. But I do know that if and when, if let's say the church secretary makes a decision, but the pastor who might be named as president or the chair of trustees who might be named as president doesn't agree with what Pat said, does that open up a whole nother legal matter that Pat was not authorized to sign a mediation to begin with and thus is non-binding?
Yeah, excellent. So I'm going to couch that concern in the greater concern that we already have as mediators to make sure that we have the right people at the table. And so I think that would be a question that we would be asking in any case where there's an organization, right? Like I'm thinking of, tenant associations or lakeside property associations, different mediation cases that I've encountered where there was a question about who had the authority to bind the association. And so I think you're saying that especially in these cases involving a religious entity, it is especially important to find out whether they have authority to speak on behalf of the entity.
That legal authority, my experience is most churches have no idea who that person is.
Okay. And so then you would ask that question, and you'd ask that early on. Ideally, it would be an intake, right? But it doesn't always get covered in intake. So you'd ask it early on in the mediation and then allow them to adjourn. You know, would you like to adjourn so you can find out who the people are, or so you can make sure that whatever agreement we sign is going to be legally enforceable? So I think that's a mediator question, regardless of whether people are lawyers or not, right? Yeah. So that's a great point.
And we have two more questions here from the
Okay.
live people. Alexandria, did you have a comment or a question?
I have a comment. As a mediator, I think we're supposed to be very open to everyone's idea, but one thing that keeps coming to mind is there is a separation of church and state. And the fact that these two parties could not settle outside of that, to me means it's none of my business what they believe. I would not even go that route at all. I would just begin the mediation as if I was with two parties that wanted to resolve a conflict. And if they discover along the way, you know, somebody will make a comment like, well, I talked to Joe and he told me this. And then the church person says, well, Joe shouldn't have promised you that. Then they can start talking within their own context. But I don't think that I would be the one that would ask them anything about their religious affiliation. My point.
Yep, I totally get that, and that is definitely the safer course for a mediator, right? I'm suggesting these as something that you could do if you want to explore that a little bit, but your approach is certainly defensible. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
And Patricia, you had a comment or a question, and welcome. It's so good to see you here.
Yeah, I was sitting here and I was thinking, and I was listening to what you had said, because my denomination is Church of God in Christ. So with a situation like this, we have a trustee committee that makes those type of decisions. And also the secretary, they was trying to get in touch with the secretary. The secretary would never make such a decision like that for the church. So the trustee committee, because they are in charge of all the church finances and everything, even though they would discuss it with the pastor, but still the trustee committee would have the final say so on it.
She might think she gets to make all the decisions.
Okay, so this is a great example of how we bring our own personal experience to the mediation too, right? And so you're thinking, this isn't the way my church would do this. Is this really the right person to be here? And did she really have authority? And what's going on here? And so what do we do with that as a mediator? A couple of suggestions. One is that we, try to turn that off completely and pretend that you don't have any knowledge of this at all. Another thing you could do is to turn your own experience and your own doubts into questions that you would ask them. So could you help me understand who has the authority to make decisions about what bills get paid at your church? And could you help me understand who has to sign off on that? Could you help me understand, Pat, how it came to be that you were designated as the representative for the church here today? So all of those things that you brought up, then you can turn those into mediator questions.
And
So, oh, yep.
One more question on the chat that came in.
Yeah.
What laws do we need to be aware of when using such tactics?
What laws? I'm going to turn that back on you. What are you thinking? What laws might we need to be aware of?
Diane, do you have?
Well,
Yeah,
I was thinking more along the lines of Alex's concerns about separation of church and state, and just treading very carefully. In my previous life, I would be, my work, I would have been extremely hesitant, though I have my own, spiritual beliefs, to tread in and be at all very upfront. I mean, of course, you acknowledge that it's a church and that this difference between people, and if they talk, that's great. But I just wondered if you had run into any legal thoughts. Legalistically, would we be tramping around in an area we shouldn't be?
I don't think there's anything legally. I mean, you all are right to be cautious about this because it is a sensitive area on lots of different levels: the personal level, the legal level, the constitutional level. I know I did one case where it was two gentlemen who had a contract dispute, and one of them said in the course of the mediation, the fact that we both go to the same church doesn't have anything to do with this. And I perked up my ears like, oh, wow, they both go to the same church. Isn't that interesting? And so that gave me an opportunity to ask them some of these questions. You know, does it make a difference that you go to the same church? Is there a process that you could follow? They quickly decided that they didn't want to go there and they wanted to resolve it in mediation, and that was fine. But, you know, I just raised it as a question. So, yeah, so some of you are rightly cautious about this. Anybody think that this is something that they could use in a mediation, or they have used it in a mediation where they've asked parties, like, how does this impact the way you resolve your case?
That's a good
Or
question.
would you like to incorporate these principles into the process at all? Anybody done anything like that, or can you imagine doing that?
You know,
Yeah,
so one of the things I was thinking is that even in a church dispute where I'm working with two people who are part of a church and that's part of the issues in the church, I haven't, and I'm embarrassed now about that.
And Zena, why do you think you didn't?
I'm thinking of several different cases. In one, I was more familiar with that faith tradition and didn't feel like there was anything in particular that was particular to it. But with the others, it's my unfamiliarity with what those traditions might be, and feeling like I might be putting people on the spot. And if the church board didn't ask that, if the minister didn't ask that, and they sent it to me instead, doesn't that say something?
Yep, that's true. That's true. You know, as I was putting these questions together, I was imagining that I was mediating with two parties who are of a different faith tradition than my own. And I think you know, if it was two Sikh parties in front of me and I found that out in the mediation, I could ask them those questions. You know, is there something in your tradition that tells you how to resolve these disputes? Or are there any principles from your tradition that you would like to incorporate into the dispute resolution process? So, so the fact that you don't know anything about that particular tradition would actually make it easier to ask the questions, you know, neutrally, and be prepared to take no for an answer. Al, did you want to say something?
No, I was just thinking of or losing track of what our traditional responsibility as mediators is, and that is to make both parties aware of the fact that this is their opportunity to resolve the matter, particularly at least in those instances where the matters come to us from a court reference or an order from a court, and not lose sight of the fact that they have an opportunity to control this potential agreement, and they've been empowered to do that at this level, and they would be forsaking that if in fact they are not successful and it's left in the hands of an arbitrator or a dispute, a mediator, excuse me, a judge or somebody else who is going to make a decision for them. I just don't know exactly how you embrace any kind of philosophical differences they might have about religion, or any common ground they might have about religion, but they can look at things like the 10 Commandments as a rule of how you deal with other people, and find some common ground there where you find some trust in the process that you're utilizing in this mediation form, as opposed to looking just strictly at what the law might be. So
yeah, exactly. Right. It's another tool. And I am totally with you. I'm a big proponent of party self-determination, right? So I'm not suggesting that we overrule that in any way, shape, or form, but it's you know, is it another tool that we can use to help these parties develop a satisfactory dispute resolution process and help them come up with a satisfying resolution too? That's all we're doing here. I see that hand, Diane, but there's a comment in the chat from Phyllis. I think it can be very difficult to presume what the party's religious attitudes. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not suggesting that we presume. Why would we not just approach this characteristic as we would any other? Yeah, yes, absolutely. So, yeah, you definitely could. And you're just asking open questions. And if the parties say no, you let that go. Diane?
So you asked how have we dealt with anything like this, and I would say that part of my reflecting back could have been or has been, I hear that you're speaking from a very deep conviction, and that you have a long faith tradition, you know, acknowledge that brings you here, and I'd be trying to get them to focus on the best part of that faith tradition so that they began to speak in some of those positive points, presuming that faith tradition had positive points, but so acknowledging it and then and hopefully deeply, and then moving on from there to see, as Al said, sort of what their conversations might be back and forth, because it could get testy. You know, I believe this, you believe that, but putting it into the individual.
Yeah, very well said, Diane. I totally agree. Yes, I love the way you were talking about that, reframing it and framing it as questions. Yeah, good.
And we have a question from the room.
Okay.
I'm curious if, from your experience, if parties have found it offensive reflecting on their kind of go along with, here I am to resolve something, my faith has nothing to do with it. So has there ever been parties that say, I don't want to go there?
Again, I'm just suggesting that you reflect back what they're saying. So I'm assuming that they have already raised it, or you know that it's a religious entity because it's First Church of Ann Arbor, or it's the Sikh temple, or you know, whatever. So you know that it is a religious entity. But certainly, if people say I'm not interested in talking about that, that's the end of the game. So, and you can raise it as a you know, a nice open-ended question, as you know how to do as mediators, and so it's not threatening, and you're not offering a bias in any way. You're looking for tools, right? You're looking for different things that the parties might share that might unlock a resolution for them, and if this is one that they can agree on, then let's go for it.
Yeah. And I think Joan Martin had her hand up. Joan, do you still have a comment or a question?
I have a comment. I had a situation. There was two Muslim men who wanted to work through their faith, but the part that required mediation was to focus on what hadn't been working for them already. So there was something missing. They had the faith, and they could be very agreeable, but one of them had been unsettled by not knowing what the other one was doing and wasn't paying, and they needed to work into the agreement that kind of communication, address the communication that was missing, so that one of them had expectations and wouldn't be left hanging. So I guess it's just accepting that and moving on to what's not working for you, because you're friends and you've been dealing with this for a while, but you come here for our expertise.
Right. Yes. And that's sort of acknowledging that on some level, they could have chosen a different forum to resolve this, and they have chosen mediation at the Dispute Resolution Center. And so we're just going to deal with it the way that we do. Did you think at any point, Joan, about asking them whether their faith offered any guidance for how to resolve this?
Oh, I didn't need to ask. Came in with both agreeing that they had a clear idea what they wanted to do.
Okay.
But it
Okay.
was, so as I say, it was a piece missing that they needed to add in their agreement.
Yeah. Yeah. So, just asking if they both are adherents of the faith, asking them, what ideas do you have based on your faith? That might, generate some things. Greta says if it's a conflict between a church, a large institution versus an individual, isn't part of the problem keeping a balance? Of course, that is always a challenge, right? And I'm sure, Al, you ran into that, and Melissa, you probably did too, in those cases where there's a church. Well, I guess one of the disputes was about the church governance or something, right? That was, I think, the one that Melissa
Yes.
did. Okay. But yes, so those other dynamics, anytime you have a large entity and an individual, sure, there's a power imbalance. Yep.
I
So
would
that,
say anything you're dealing with the pastor, a pastor, a congregate, you're always going to have a power imbalance.
Yep. Yeah. Good questions. Okay. Thanks, Diane. Appreciate your input. So how much time do we have left, Gail?
About 25 minutes, 30 minutes.
So let me get a sense of the group. We could practice this role play, so you could practice asking these questions and just test the waters to see what it feels like. Or I could tell you a little bit more about Christian mediation. So maybe I'll ask for a show of hands. How many would like to practice the role play? It's like 10 minutes, and we just do it in breakouts. It's not very threatening. Role play, do we have hands? I'm not seeing so many. There's another one. Okay. All right. Christian mediation. Do we have any interest in hearing about that? We've got one in the chat. Seems like there's more interest in that one. All right.
Three and four.
Okay. You guys don't like role plays, huh?
Actually, I was offering cocktails in our breakout room.
Why didn't I think of that?
I'm going wherever Al goes.
I don't do that before 3 o'clock, Al. That's my ground rule. But yeah, okay. Yeah. So I can tell you a little bit about the Christian mediation process, and I think it's not so different from. I think other faith traditions have a similar process. So let me share my screen here. The goal of Christian mediation is both resolution of the conflict and reconciliation of the relationship. So right there, we've kind of tripled the task, because, it's one thing to get the people to figure out how much the church owes to the printer, right? But it's another whole thing to get them to apologize and reconcile their relationship and not take it personally and not carry that through. So there's a lot more work involved. The basic mediation process is familiar to you, but there are some other layers to it. And a lot of those happen before the mediation. So I would say initially there's an agreement on Christian principles, and those would include things like love your neighbor as yourself. There's a verse that says, look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. So who knew that interest-based bargaining actually came from the New Testament? I bet you didn't know that, did you? I don't think Fisher and Uri knew that, but it does. So it's very helpful. Questions like, how can I honor God in this process? And that would be a result of the person saying that it's very important to them to honor God in whatever they do. And that would even include a dispute resolution process. And then how can they honor God in this process? And a high view of Scripture. And so what does the Bible say here? How has my behavior conformed to Scripture? How has it departed from Scripture? Is there guidance here that I can use in dealing with how I resolve this conflict. So those would all be preparatory things. And then we do a lot of work with each side separately before we bring them together. And so if you want to think of that as pre-mediation, we actually call it conflict coaching. You're coaching each side to be prepared to resolve the conflict when the parties come together in joint session. And so parties have a lot of homework. So one of the things we do is we give them a booklet. This is an example. This one's called The Path of a Peacemaker from Peacemaker Ministries. And it asks them to write out the conflict from their perspective, write out the conflict from the other party's perspective, think about how God might be at work within the conflict, think about how they may have contributed to the conflict, think about how they might need to forgive the other person for the way the other person has behaved in the conflict, because those are cardinal Christian principles. Just getting some humility. One of the tasks that we ask people to do ahead of time is what we call the log and speck list. So Jesus famously said, how can you go after the speck in your neighbor's eye when you haven't dealt with the log in your own eye? And so we ask people to make a list of the specks in the neighbor's eye and also the logs in their own eye. So it's very, humbling process. And when it looks like the parties are ready to come together, like it looks like there's going to be some reconciliation, then we bring them together for a mediation process. And the process itself, the mediation is familiar. The mediator typically opens with the opening, describing everything that's going to happen, but also including prayer, and may include a scripture reading. But then otherwise, working together as long as possible, and then using caucus if necessary, then coming up with an agreement. The ground rules may be based on scripture. And so I was thinking I had a slide on that, but I guess I don't. So there, for example, speak respectfully, be quick to listen, slow to speak, speak the truth in love. Those are all based on scripture. So they're familiar ground rules, it's don't interrupt, no name calling, but we're just grounding them in scripture. And attorneys may be present, or they may not be. Yes, can I share that screen with the final slide again? Yes, I can. So for example, I was contacted about a case where two Christian organizations both had launched a program with the same name. So these organizations were located in different states, but they had used the same name for this program, and there was donor confusion. So people thought they were donating to the organization in Indiana, but instead it went to the one in Michigan. One entity sent a nasty letter to the other. So this is another thing. I don't know.
It's a good
I don't
start.
know if this is true of all organizations, but Christians often do not hire Christian lawyers. And so they hire people who maybe are not behaving totally consistently. And this is true of churches even, who don't always operate consistent with the values that the person espouses. So the one side had sent a nasty letter to the other side, and I can't remember if they had actually gone to court or just were threatening it, but it was very testy between the two organizations. So the attorneys contacted me about doing a mediation, but when I found out that it was two Christian entities, I asked if there was a way that we could incorporate Christian principles into the mediation process. And both attorneys were Christians, they just didn't know how to do that. And so we did some work with each of the individuals ahead of time. So typically when lawyers are involved, I, as the mediator, don't meet the clients until the day of the mediation. But in this case, I asked if we could have some time ahead and gave them some homework and worked with each of them. And when they came together, they were able to come up with a new name for one of the programs, and that worked great. And the best part was, as the attorneys were drafting the agreement, the parties were happily chattering over on the side edge of the room. So there was a level of reconciliation there. So that's a case where everybody was a Christian, but they didn't know about the Christian process, and they knew that I was a Christian, and so they asked me to be the mediator. But then I asked them if we could incorporate more of these principles into the process, and they agreed with that. So questions, comments about religious faith-based mediation?
It's not that tight, but it's a point I would make or ask you. You talked about the camaraderie there was between the parties while the lawyers were framing the settlement. And that had to be in a meeting environment, unlike our Zooming relationships. And as a mediator, one of the great frustrations I've experienced since the pandemic is the loss of the opportunity to get to read body English, even to smell the other parties as becoming familiar with everybody that you get in a very personal gathering that we often get in the conference room that you just don't get in this Zooming environment.
Yeah, that's a great point, Al. Can I get an amen?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think yes, there are many advantages to Zoom, right? People don't have to travel. We can do it in winter. We don't have to worry about those kinds of things. But you're right.
A complete admission. I'm wearing a dress shirt, but I've got shorts on, so I can only do this in a Zooming environment.
Shall I ask how many other people have shorts? No, I'm not going to do that. But
TMI. TMI.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Yep.
The question then is, did those two parties you just talked about, did they meet face to face?
Yes, that was back in the days when all we did was joint session. We would never think of not doing it in person. So yes, that was all in a conference room. Yeah, and there was a lot of mistrust going into, and I think that's characteristic of these cases where both sides are of the same faith tradition. If they've gotten to the point where one of them has sued the other, there's a huge loss of trust, and the expectation of trust is higher. You know, you're a member of my same faith community. We espouse the same beliefs, and yet you sued me. And so it's even more disappointing. I think that's always going on in these cases where there's religious beliefs on both sides. That loss of trust is huge, that disappointment.
Melissa had a comment or a question.
Anne, would you mind sharing a little bit about your reflections and theories, perhaps, as you are observing, especially institutions, churches entering into mediation? Your thoughts, again, theories as to why we're seeing such an increase in churches engaging in mediation right now.
Yeah. Oh, oh, Melissa, I could talk about that for an hour.
Yeah, 20 minutes.
I have talked about this with lots of different entities. There is certainly a thought that the American justice system is pretty good and it's pretty fair, and there often is a sense that whatever alternative the church has is not as equal, is not as balanced, that they really have this perception that they're going to get a better shake in the courts, in the civil courts, than they would in their internal system. So that, that's a problem for the Yeah, for all denominations, right? It's not just what are they providing a fair process, but how are they perceived?
Mhm, mhm.
I think there is a sense that it's too limiting to follow the strictures of our faith, and we're going to have more options and we're going to get a better result if we go to court. There's probably also some skepticism, like, are we going to get this resolved if we try to do it ourselves? Wouldn't we be better off just going to a judge and having a judge make a final decision? So those are some thoughts off the top of my head. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm interested for you to hear from you, like what are you going to do differently as a mediator the next time you get a case that involves a religious entity? Has this discussion given you some new ideas of how you might handle things a little differently?
Because I certainly will be more willing to listen to their conversation as to what they think each one should have done. Because you brought in the idea that people have expectations of what a church is allowed to do to an individual or the other way around. So it wouldn't have dawned on me before this meeting that maybe I shouldn't dismiss that so easily. That it might be an opening to getting them to talk to each other. Not that I would want to necessarily bring up anything concerning their faith, but to more or less, like you said, say, well, is this something you two want to talk about for a minute? Or do you ask the other party, do you have a response to that particular statement? I guess might be all right, without bringing in anybody's particular faith of what they're doing.
Yes, exactly. Thanks for sharing that, Alex. Yes, I totally agree.
So it brings another aspect into the mediation.
Right.
That I hadn't thought of before. So I appreciate your coming here.
Good. Thank you. That is exactly what I was hoping to accomplish. I want to give you more tools and not, be like, oh, I can't go anywhere near that religious stuff.
Yeah,
Good. Anyone else?
I feel a little more confident of going there, to acknowledge it more and to use that as a tool, to use it as something that they have in common that we can build on.
Anyone else? Well, it does look like you are probably going to continue to get these cases involving religious entities. So some of you who are in this room may have opportunities sooner rather than later to put some of this to work. I hope the questions, the questions that I offered that are on the handout are just examples. They're certainly not scripts or formulas or anything, but just to get you thinking about the kinds of questions that you could pose to both parties when they, when that both parties are coming from the same religious perspective. So, yeah.
Could I ask you, can you send us information if we were to ever come across two parties that are interested in this and we don't feel the least bit prepared? Can we send them to you?
Of course. Or maybe I could co-mediate with you.
Are you in Michigan? I mean, I don't know.
I'm in Grand Rapids, and I volunteer at our local dispute resolution center. But now that we've got Zoom, right, we could do some co-mediation across the state. I would be happy to do that. Yeah. Zena, I see your hand.
So when you are, excuse me, if you are hired by a religious institution, are there questions that you ask of the institution before you start a mediation? So for example, if you're asked to to work on anything from an interpersonal dispute to a dispute between the congregation and the minister. I mean, however small or however large it is. Are
Mhm.
there institutional questions that you ask?
Well, I do appreciate what got raised before about who has the authority to make a decision. So yeah, so for example, I was just working on a case this summer where a member was unhappy with the spending practices of the pastor, and he raised some complaints and didn't get the kind of resolution he was looking for. A big issue in the case was who's going to be in the mediation representing the church, because it wasn't just the pastor, it was the treasurer, and was it also the chairman of the board and the assistant pastor. And so those kinds of things of figuring out who needs to be at the table. But those questions happen in a lot of nonprofit organizations, right? So in that sense, it's not much different. I certainly ask them about whether the church has any policy on conflict resolution or, dispute resolution policies, those kind of things. I would ask the individual that too. I would ask everybody that question. Yeah. I don't know that there's anything, I can't think of anything off the top of my head that's unique that I would ask the church.
Well, would you ask at that point if they did have dispute resolution provisions within their charter? Would you want to make sure they've exhausted those before you got involved, or would you want to participate in that? How would you integrate yourself with those?
Yeah, it certainly would be a question that I would be asking them. In this case, it was a Presbyterian church, and they had brought the member had brought the complaint to the presbytery. And what he initially told me was that the presbytery told him that he didn't have any standing to raise this complaint about the pastor. And that didn't make any sense to me. But what I found out later is that by the time the member raised this complaint with the presbytery, he was no longer a member. He had left the church and joined another church. And so now I can see why the presbytery would say, it's kind of moot, unless somebody else brings this issue, you're not part of our flock anymore, right? So that made sense. But yeah, certainly that's one of the questions that I ask churches when they call me is, what are your internal dispute resolution procedures, and have you followed them? And if you haven't, why not? And why are you calling me instead of doing something internal? That would definitely be something to explore.
I was looking at your question, how does your faith inform how you deal with this dispute, and wondering whether that's a question you might ask an entity.
Absolutely. I think you could, because they're represented by an individual, right? And so that individual adheres to that faith. So what would be those principles that you could bring to bear? Yeah. Phyllis has a question in the chat. Can you mention how things might be different when they're two different faiths? I have to think about that. I think you probably best explored in caucus, right? But I might be brave enough to ask in joint session, point out, Jack, you're a professing Muslim, and Jill, you're a professing Christian. I'm just wondering if there are any common principles of your faith that you might be able to bring to bear in this process. I might ask them something like that, like peace. That would be, something that both of those traditions value highly. And so we might be able to get a conversation going like that. I've never done that, but because I've never had a case where I knew that the parties were of different traditions, but it would be interesting to do. Yeah, good. Yep, Greta, you got to follow up?
It's not so much a follow-up, but in a situation that I knew about and that there was no mediation. It was a case between two religious institutions, one of which had a very flat, locally run structure, and the other was very, very hierarchical, and therefore the local entity really couldn't be at the table, and it made the process very cumbersome to resolve because it was as if one entity was off the ranch someplace else and was phoning in. Ultimately, I think it was resolved, but there was a very distinctly there was a difficulty because they were not governed in the same fashion.
Yes, yes, I can see how that would be. That would be a big challenge. Yeah. Yeah. So in that case, it was the structure more than the religion. Like it could have been two nonprofits that were structured differently, and you would have had the same kind of challenge. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay. Anything else? Well,
That's
it's
good.
been really fun. Yeah, you're very welcome. It's been really fun to share with you. I'm excited to hear of all the good work you are doing in Ann Arbor, making peace over there. We need that. So keep that up and have a great time at your volunteer appreciation party. That sounds like a lot of fun. So
Well,
thank you again, Gail, for making this work. I told her that I was at a conference a couple weeks ago that was hybrid and it didn't work. I was there in person, but they couldn't get the online people to get online, and it impinged on the presentation that we did in person. In short, it was a disaster. So I was a little leery today, but Gail made it work. So thank you, Gail. Excellent job. Appreciate you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Anne. We really appreciate your time, and this has just been very insightful and extremely helpful. So thank you, everybody. And we're applauding here live and in person.